you ever wondered what it's like to sit in on a magazine editorial meeting? Well, this is your chance. You're listening to Salt Lake Speaks, a monthly podcast where our editors, writers, and staff dig deeper into stories, chat with newsmakers, and talk amongst ourselves about arts, culture, food, music, politics, or whatever else might strike our fancy. After all, we are Utah's biggest fans.
I'm Mary Brown Maloof.
I'm Glenn Warchel.
I am Christy Marcy.
And we're Salt Lake Speaks.
Hi, thanks for joining us on Salt Lake Speaks again. I'm Glenn Warchel, managing editor at Salt Lake Magazine. Today we're talking to Representative Brian King, who represents Salt Lake City at the state legislature. Here are the disturbing facts. 4 out of 10 murders in Utah result from domestic violence, and more than half of those killings are done with a gun. Representative King is proposing House Bill 206, a change to Utah law that would add protective orders for domestic violence to the list of things that bar gun ownership. In the past, it's things like felonies and other serious crimes, but the representative would like to add to that protective orders for domestic violence or a conviction of domestic violence. Representative King, keeping guns out of domestic dispute situations seems to be so commonsensical that it would be a slam dunk gun control bill. Am I missing something?
Anytime you talk about guns, it's controversial. The Second Amendment community feels very strongly about this, as we all know. And guns are incredibly common, number one, especially here in Utah, a western state, but they're also incredibly lethal. I mean, they can quickly and easily, relatively speaking, compared to other means of ending a person's life, they can injure or kill someone. So it is a no-brainer from my perspective, Glenn. And one of the things that the bill is trying to do is basically take prohibitions that currently exist on the federal level. They already exist. The federal law makes it illegal for someone who's been convicted of any type of domestic violence, whether it's a felony or a misdemeanor. It already makes it illegal for them to own, purchase, or possess a firearm. It also makes it illegal for individuals who've had protective orders entered against them to own, purchase, or possess a firearm. I think it makes sense to replicate those laws at the state level. And some people say, well, why does that matter? I mean, how does that help? Here's what people need to understand about federal and state law. Federal law is in place and is enforced by federal enforcement authority. In this particular area, it's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms that generally enforces federal firearms laws. And U.S. attorneys are the ones that prosecute those charges. That is a very small percentage of the law enforcement and prosecutorial resources that are available here in the state of Utah. Most crimes are charged and are prosecuted under state law, or counties and cities prosecute those things. So my feeling is if we make these prohibitions replicated on the state level, will bring a lot more resources to the table.
Now, a couple of potential hang-ups I can see from having covered gun legislation in the past is that getting a protective order doesn't require a judge signs it, but it doesn't require the level of scrutiny that being convicted of a domestic violence crime is. And I could see the gun lobby in particular saying you can't take a person's Second Amendment right away based on this lower level standard of justice.
Yeah.
How do you answer that?
Well, I haven't really heard that from the gun community so far. I think that protective orders, as they are currently required the legal requirements of getting protective orders that are currently in place, the barriers are not insignificant. You've got to have an opportunity to be heard. You can do it on an expedited basis, on what we call in the law an ex parte basis. But an ex parte protective order that's issued has to be followed up within a very short time frame with a full hearing if an individual requests it. Sometimes you have individuals who don't contest the protective order. And for those individuals, I think that if they are not willing to acknowledge that a protective order is appropriate and they're willing to allow one to be in place, it doesn't trouble me to have these prohibitions be in place. So it's true that individuals, even after a full hearing for a protective order, if a protective order is granted, that doesn't mean they've been convicted of anything. But there has been an evidentiary hearing and information put before a hearing officer, a judge who has made the determination that a protective order is necessary. That's something that we're talking about right now, but honestly, the folks within the Second Amendment community that I have talked to about this particular bill haven't raised that particular distinction that you're raising. Mm-hmm. They haven't said, okay, we're fine with convictions for misdemeanors or felonies under domestic violence statutes, but we're not fine with protective orders. So I think the feeling is, on the part of many, not all, but many people in the Second Amendment community is, if it's already illegal on the federal level, it doesn't make sense to push back and try and fight this occurring and being put in place on the state level.
One of the big points that's brought up in a lot of gun regulations and gun regulations bills and bills that try to regulate concealed carry is that there are no incidents of violence or homicides related to the particular regulatory thing. In this case, have there been cases that support the bill? Have people
who've had domestic violence convictions, had guns and carried out,
Are there instances of people under protective orders killing family members while they were under protective order?
I can't tell you that I know of those particular circumstances here in Utah. But I can tell you this, as you say, that statistic that you quoted earlier is an accurate statistic. Namely, that of the homicides that occur here in the state of Utah involving guns, 40% of them arise out of domestic violence situations. Now, does that mean that every person who is killed in a domestic violence situation has been previously convicted or that they have a protective order entered against them? Mm-hmm. Of course not. Absolutely not. But I think that if people in the state of Utah recognize that once they've been convicted of domestic violence, they are going to have real resources, significantly more resources brought to bear to ensure that they can't continue to own or purchase or possess guns, it will do two things. Number one, I think it will make people less likely in the first place to commit acts of domestic violence. And number two, I think it will make individuals who have been convicted think twice before they continue to possess or try and purchase a firearm themselves. And they'll give them up more in greater circumstances. So we're talking about, in terms of the practical effect of the bill, something that's a little bit unknowable. But my sense is that with education about what the effect of the bill is, and especially with law enforcement agencies and prosecutors more sensitive to the idea that this is an area that they should be looking at prosecuting and they should be looking at investigating, you make it more likely that you reduce the number of these incidences.
And then finally, the other issue is there's sort of a knee-jerk reaction by staunch gun supporters that any gun regulation, is the slippery slope that will lead to having our guns taken from us.
Yeah.
How do you get around that sort of?
Well, here's what I would say to those folks. I mean, I'm a gun owner myself. I don't have any great knee-jerk reaction that's negative toward guns. I would say to gun owners and Second Amendment activists, there should be an attempt to find some common ground on reasonable actions and measures to reduce gun violence. This is a pretty reasonable measure to reduce gun violence. And I think that more and more Second Amendment activists are recognizing that you better pick your battles carefully. You can't just have this reflexive no to everything that's proposed that has a connection to reducing gun violence. If you do that, you're just going to find you lose credibility with your activism and that individuals write you off as being not worth talking to. And even in Utah, a very conservative state and a state that is very friendly to gun owners' rights and Second Amendment rights, there are common sense measures that people want to see put in place. Universal background checks is one, for example. That polls extraordinarily high over and over and over again across the country and in Utah. That's something that the Second Amendment community has taken a real stand on, and they're not deviating. I've investigated the possibility of pursuing those kind of bills, and they won't go anywhere. And so I think that what the Second Amendment community is saying to some extent is, we're picking our battles carefully here. And if there are some things that make sense to us, namely that people who've been convicted of domestic violence, where it's already illegal on the federal level, shouldn't have guns, and we want to put some resources in place at the state level to reiterate that, that's something that they've made the choice makes sense. And it does make sense, I think. So I can't, it's easy to sort of point fingers and complain, but I have to tell you, the folks that I have spoken with in the Second Amendment community on this particular bill have been good to work with so far.
With all due respect, with the new president, Donald Trump, and a sort of a arch conservative movement in the country that has just happened over the last week or so.
Yeah.
Do you think this is going to be a change everything, considering gun bills too? That anything that smacks of liberalism or elitism or anything like that will just be out of hand?
That's a great question, and we ask ourselves that here at the legislature about not just the gun bills, but other bills too. To what extent is the election of Donald Trump emboldening really conservative folks to sort of say, hey, we have a supermajority at the Utah State Legislature, we have control of the White House, we have control of Congress, you'll do what we want you to do and nothing more. I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I've seen, we are now about 10 days into our session, and I've seen some things that make me think that there is this sort of attitude or newly emboldened feeling, and I've seen other things that make me think it's pretty much the way it's been in the past, and we're looking to find areas of common ground where we can work with our Republican colleagues, and we're finding them. And the Republicans on issues that make sense are backing down and sort of seeing our point of view as Democrats and saying, okay, we'll work with you on that. So I think it's a little too early. I think the end of the session will know better the extent to which the election of Donald Trump has sort of changed the political climate or the terrain here.
Well, of course, you being a Democrat in Utah, you've been living the Donald Trump regime for your entire career, where you're overwhelmingly opposed on everything you do. So maybe you won't see a large, significant change in things because it's just the way it's always been.
No, that's true. And it's also been true that Democrats in the state legislature over my time here, which has now been since 2009, have been remarkably successful at getting their legislation through. It comes by working closely with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and we try and run common sense, good legislation that reflects good values and priorities and is a sound public policy. And I think we're remarkably successful doing that as Democrats up here. And so much of politics is relationship-based. I mean, it's the old Tip O'Neill line about all politics is local. Well, what he was basically saying is you've got to get to know people, and you've got to get to a point where they trust you and you trust them, and you can accomplish some things working together. We do a pretty good job of that here in Utah. We do a much better job of it here in Utah than they do in D.C. And I hope that doesn't change. You can ask me more at the end of the session if I think it has.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Representative King. This is Salt Lake Speaks. It's a monthly podcast produced by the writers and editors of Salt Lake Magazine. And you can tune into it at www.saltlakemagazine.com/podcast.